I took the job because I needed the money. That's how these stories always start, right? Desperation, a little pride, and a willingness to ignore the warning signs. I'd been out of work for months, bills stacking up like a game of Jenga, each one threatening to topple everything I'd built. So when the ad popped up, overnight security needed, Westgate Mall, $25 per hour, immediate start. No experience necessary. I didn't think twice. I didn't even think once. I just called the number, scheduled the interview, and showed up the next night with my only clean shirt and a resume that looked more like a confession than a list of accomplishments. Westgate Mall had been closed for years. I remembered it from when I was a kid, back when it was the place to be on a Saturday. The food court always smelled like pizza and cinnamon, and the arcade was a neon-lit cave where you could lose hours and quarters in equal measure. But that was before the anchor stores pulled out, before the rumors started about the break-ins, the fires, the things people saw after dark. Now, the parking lot was a graveyard of weeds and broken glass, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp that buzzed like a dying insect. The interview was short. A man named Mr. Grady met me at the service entrance, clipboard in hand, eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He didn't ask about my experience, didn't care about my references. He just handed me a badge, a flashlight, and a set of keys that jingled like wind chimes in a storm. "Your shift's midnight to 6, he said, voice flat as a dial tone. "Stay inside. Lock the doors behind you. Don't let anyone in. Don't go into the basement. And whatever you do, don't look at the mannequins." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. He didn't. He just stared at me, lips pressed into a thin line, until I nodded and promised to follow the rules. Then he left, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor, leaving me alone with the silence and the keys. The first hour was easy. I walked the perimeter, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. The stores were all shuttered, their signs faded and cracked. The food court was a wasteland of overturned chairs and empty soda cups, the smell of old grease lingering in the air. I checked the doors, made sure they were locked, and tried not to think about how much the place felt like a tomb. It was the mannequins that got to me. They were everywhere, propped up in store windows, clustered in corners, some missing arms or heads, others dressed in clothes that hadn't been fashionable in decades. Their faces were blank, eyes painted on in a way that made them look almost human, almost aware. I kept my distance, just like Mr. Grady said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, tracking my movements with those empty painted eyes. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the first noise. A soft scraping, like something dragging across tile. I froze, heart pounding, and listened. It came again, closer this time, from the direction of the old department store. I told myself it was just a rat, maybe a stray cat that had found its way inside. But when I shined my flashlight down the corridor, the beam caught on something pale and motionless, a mannequin, standing in the middle of the hallway, arms outstretched as if reaching for me. I hadn't seen it there before. I was sure of it. I'd walked that hallway twice already, and the mannequins had all been behind glass, locked away in their display cases. This one was different. It wore a red dress, the fabric torn and stained, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening for something only it could hear. I backed away, keeping the light on it, and tried to remember Mr. Grady's words. "Don't look at the mannequins." But how could I not? It was right there, blocking my path, its painted eyes fixed on me. I forced myself to turn away, to keep moving, but every instinct screamed at me to look back, to make sure it wasn't following. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see another mannequin, closer this time, arms reaching, head cocked. I started counting them, keeping track of where they were, but it didn't help. They seemed to multiply, appearing in places I was sure I'd already checked. By the time the sun started to rise, I was a wreck, sweating, shaking, convinced that I'd lost my mind. Mr. Grady was waiting for me at the exit, just as the first light crept through the skylights. He didn't ask how my shift went. He just took the keys, handed me an envelope with my pay, and told me to come back the next night if I wanted the job. I should have said no. I should have walked away, found something else, anything else. But the money was good, and I needed it. So I nodded, pocketed the envelope, and promised myself that it was just a job, just a building, just a bunch of plastic mannequins. That night, I dreamed of painted eyes and reaching hands. I woke up with the taste of fear in my mouth, the memory of cold plastic fingers brushing against my skin. I told myself it was just a dream, just nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The second night was worse. The silence felt heavier, the darkness thicker. I walked my rounds, flashlight trembling in my hand, and tried not to look at the mannequins. But they were everywhere, always in the corner of my eye, always just out of reach. I started talking to myself, just to break the silence, but even my own voice sounded wrong, echoing off the empty walls like a stranger's. At 2:30, I heard the scraping again. This time, it was louder, closer, coming from the food court. I crept toward the sound, heart hammering, and found a mannequin standing in front of the old pizza place, its arms raised as if in greeting. Its head was missing, the neck a jagged stump, but I could feel its gaze all the same. I tried to ignore it, to keep walking, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the headless mannequin as if it might suddenly spring to life. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the mall itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the floor, the walls, anything but the thing in front of me. But even with my eyes averted, I could sense it, an invisible pressure, a presence that pressed against my skin like static. I took a shaky breath and turned back the way I'd come, determined to finish my rounds and get through the night. But as I walked, I realized something was wrong. The mannequins had moved. The one in the red dress was gone from the hallway, replaced by another, this one in a faded suit, its hands clasped in front of it like a mourner at a funeral. In the shoe store, a cluster of mannequins stood in a tight circle, their heads bowed, as if sharing a secret. I counted them, tried to remember how many there had been before, but the numbers never added up. I started to feel watched, not just by the mannequins, but by the building itself. Every creak, every groan of settling metal and glass, sounded like footsteps. Shadows seemed to move just out of sight, flickering at the edge of my flashlight's beam. I told myself it was just nerves, just the tricks of a tired mind, but the feeling wouldn't go away. At 3, I heard a voice. Faint, distant, echoing through the empty corridors. It was a child's voice, high and thin, singing a song I didn't recognize. The words were muffled, but the melody was clear, sweet, almost cheerful, completely out of place in the dead mall. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing, the song growing louder as I approached the old toy store. The door was ajar, the lock broken. Inside, the shelves were empty, the floor littered with dust and broken toys. In the center of the room stood a mannequin, smaller than the others, dressed in a child's clothes, overalls, a striped shirt, one shoe missing. Its head was tilted back, mouth open in a silent scream. The song stopped as soon as I entered, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I backed out of the room, heart racing, and slammed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, even though I knew it was broken. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really heard anything, that it was just the wind, just the building settling. But I knew better. Something was wrong with this place, something deeper than just old mannequins and empty stores. I finished my rounds as quickly as I could, barely glancing at the displays, refusing to meet the painted eyes that seemed to follow me everywhere. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out into the parking lot, blinking against the light, feeling like I'd escaped from a nightmare. Mr. Grady was waiting for me again, as calm and unreadable as ever. He handed me another envelope, told me to come back that night, and disappeared before I could ask any questions. I should have quit. I should have walked away and never looked back. But the money was too good, and I was too desperate. So I went home, tried to sleep, and dreamed of mannequins with painted smiles and empty eyes. The third night, I brought a thermos of coffee and a pocket knife, more for comfort than for any real protection. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a job, just a building, just a bunch of plastic and fiberglass. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt the weight of the place settle on my shoulders, heavier than before. The mannequins were waiting for me. I could feel it. They stood in their windows and corners, silent and still, but I knew they were aware of me. I started my rounds, moving quickly, refusing to look at them, refusing to acknowledge the way they seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. At 2, the lights flickered. Just for a moment, but long enough to plunge the mall into darkness. My flashlight sputtered, the beam wavering, and I felt a surge of panic. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was dead, the battery drained even though I'd charged it before my shift. I stood there, surrounded by darkness, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, slowly, the lights came back on. Not all at once, but in a wave, one section at a time, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The mannequins had moved again. They stood in new positions, closer to the center of the mall, as if converging on a single point. I tried to retrace my steps, to remember where they'd been before, but it was impossible. They were everywhere, filling the corridors, blocking the exits, their painted eyes fixed on me. I tried to call Mr. Grady, but the phone was still dead. I considered making a run for it, but the doors were locked, the keys gone from my pocket. I was trapped, alone with the mannequins and the silence. That was when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty mall. Not the shuffling of rats or the creak of settling beams, but the steady, measured tread of someone or something walking with purpose. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to fill the entire building. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding, and waited. The footsteps stopped just outside the old jewelry store, the door hanging open, the display cases empty and shattered. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear anything over the roar of my own fear. Then, slowly, a mannequin stepped into the hallway. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs stiff and awkward, but it moved all the same. It turned its head toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind its painted eyes, a spark of awareness, a glimmer of something alive. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, every muscle locked in place as the mannequin took another step, then another, its feet scraping against the tile. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there and watch as it drew closer. But all I could do was stare, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The mannequin stopped just a few feet away, its head cocked to one side, as if studying me. Its painted lips were twisted into a faint, mocking smile, and for a moment, I thought I saw its fingers twitch. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned away, shuffling back down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. I slumped against the wall, my legs shaking, sweat pouring down my face. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But deep down, I knew the truth. The mannequins were moving. They were watching me. And they didn't want me there. I forced myself to keep moving, to finish my rounds, but every step felt like a struggle. The mall seemed to stretch and twist around me, the corridors longer and darker than before. The mannequins were everywhere, blocking my path, crowding the entrances to the stores. I tried not to look at them, but it was impossible. Their eyes were always on me, their faces frozen in expressions that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. At some point, I lost track of time. My watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 2:47. The lights flickered again, plunging the mall into darkness for a few heartbeats before sputtering back to life. I stumbled through the corridors, my flashlight barely illuminating the way, my mind racing with fear and confusion. That's when I heard the whispering. Soft at first, barely more than a breath, but growing louder with each step. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls, slipping through the cracks in the floor. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, desperate. I followed the sound, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dread. It led me to the old department store, the one where I'd first seen the mannequin in the red dress. The doors were open, the darkness inside thick and impenetrable. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the whispering pulled me forward. Inside, the air was colder, the silence deeper. The mannequins were arranged in a circle in the center of the room, their backs to me, their heads bowed. In the middle of the circle stood a single mannequin, different from the others. It was taller, its features more defined, its eyes painted with a precision that made them look almost real. It wore a suit, the fabric immaculate, a name tag pinned to its chest, Manager. As I stepped closer, the whispering grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. The mannequins began to move, their heads turning, their eyes locking onto mine. The manager raised its hand, pointing directly at me. The whispering stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The mannequins closed in, their arms outstretched, their fingers brushing against my skin. I felt a cold electric shock run through me, and for a moment, the world went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, the mannequins gone. The room was empty, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled out of the store, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I wandered the mall, barely aware of my surroundings, my mind replaying the scene in the department store over and over. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. Mr. Grady was waiting for me at the exit, as always. He looked me over, his expression unreadable, and handed me another envelope. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice flat. "Just remember the rules." I wanted to ask him what was happening, why the mannequins were moving, what the whispering meant. But the words caught in my throat, and all I could do was nod and walk away. That day, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw mannequins standing in circles, reaching for me, their eyes alive with something I couldn't name. I thought about quitting, about never going back, but the thought of the bills piling up, the eviction notice on my door, kept me from making the call. The fourth night, I arrived at the mall with a plan. I brought a camera, determined to catch the mannequins moving, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I started my rounds as usual, snapping photos of every mannequin I passed, making notes of their positions. For the first hour, nothing happened. The mannequins stayed where they were, silent and still, their eyes blank. But then, as I reviewed the photos on my camera, I noticed something strange. In each picture, the mannequins were in different positions than I remembered. One that had been standing by the entrance was now in the middle of the corridor. Another, which I was sure had been missing an arm, now had both arms intact. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of memory, that I was imagining things, but the evidence was right there in front of me. The mannequins were moving, and they didn't want to be caught. I kept the camera in my hand, snapping photos every few minutes, desperate to catch them in the act. But the more I tried, the more the mall seemed to resist. The lights flickered, plunging me into darkness at random intervals. My flashlight dimmed, the batteries draining faster than they should. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something sharp and metallic, like old blood. At 3 in the morning, I found myself back in the food court. The tables and chairs were arranged differently, clustered in tight groups as if the mannequins had been having a meeting in my absence. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, and saw that the mannequin in the red dress was back. This time, she stood at the center of the court, her head tilted back, her arms raised as if conducting an invisible orchestra. I raised my camera, but as I pressed the shutter, the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed me, so complete that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it was dead. My phone, too, refused to turn on. I stood there, paralyzed, listening to the silence, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, slowly, I heard the sound of footsteps. Not just one set, but dozens, maybe hundreds, echoing through the empty mall. They came from every direction, growing louder, closer, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. I pressed my back against the nearest pillar, clutching the camera like a talisman, and tried to steady my breathing. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had begun. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a single voice spoke, low and cold, echoing through the darkness. "Why are you here?" I swallowed, my mouth dry, and tried to answer, but no sound came out. The voice repeated the question, closer this time, as if the speaker was standing right beside me. "Why are you here?" I forced myself to speak, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm just doing my job." The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Then, the lights flickered back on, one by one, revealing the mannequins. They stood in a perfect circle around me, their faces turned toward me, their eyes wide and unblinking. The mannequin in the red dress stood at the front, her painted lips twisted into a smile that was almost human. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair, and landed hard on the floor. The mannequins didn't move, but I could feel their attention, a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the camera, and ran. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from them. I ducked into a service corridor, slamming the door behind me. The silence was immediate, the air cooler, the darkness less oppressive. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the camera. I checked the photos, desperate for proof, but every image was blurred, distorted, the mannequins little more than smears of color and shadow. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the distant echoes of footsteps, the occasional creak of settling metal. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that the mannequins couldn't follow me here. But deep down, I knew better. The mall was their domain, and I was just a trespasser. Eventually, I forced myself to finish my rounds. I moved quickly, avoiding the main corridors, sticking to the service tunnels and back hallways. The mannequins were still there, always just out of sight, always waiting. I could feel their eyes on me, their presence a constant pressure at the back of my mind. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out into the parking lot, exhausted and shaken. Mr. Grady was waiting for me, as always. He looked me over, his expression unreadable, and handed me another envelope. "You're still here," he said, almost as if he was surprised. "Most don't last this long." I wanted to ask him what was really going on, why the mannequins moved, what the voice in the darkness meant. But I couldn't find the words. I just nodded, took the envelope, and walked away. That day, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment, staring at the camera, scrolling through the blurry photos, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I thought about quitting, about never going back, but the money was too good, and the questions were too many. I needed answers, even if it meant risking everything. The fifth night, I arrived at the mall with a new plan. I brought extra batteries, a backup flashlight, and a notebook to document everything. I started my rounds, moving slowly, taking notes on the mannequins' positions, the sounds I heard, the changes in the air. For the first hour, nothing happened. The mannequins stayed where they were, silent and still, their eyes blank. But then, just after 2, I heard the singing again. The same child's voice, high and sweet, echoing through the empty corridors. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing, the song growing louder as I approached the old toy store. The door was open, the room dark. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The mannequin in the child's clothes stood in the center of the room, its head tilted back, its mouth open in a silent scream. The song stopped as soon as I entered, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I backed out of the room, heart racing, and slammed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, even though I knew it was broken. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really heard anything, that it was just the wind, just the building settling. But I knew better. Something was wrong with this place, something deeper than just old mannequins and empty stores. I forced myself to keep moving, to finish my rounds, but every step felt heavier than the last. The mall seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the scent of dust and old perfume. The mannequins were everywhere, their numbers growing, their positions shifting when I wasn't looking. I tried to focus on my notebook, jotting down every detail, every sound, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. But the words blurred on the page, my hands shaking too much to write clearly. At 3, the lights flickered again, plunging the mall into darkness. My backup flashlight worked, but the beam was weak, barely illuminating the path ahead. I moved slowly, careful not to trip over the debris that littered the floor. The mannequins seemed to press closer, their faces twisted into expressions I couldn't quite read: fear, anger, maybe even hunger. I turned a corner and found myself face to face with the mannequin in the red dress. She stood in the center of the hallway, her arms outstretched, her head tilted back as if she were laughing at some private joke. I tried to look away, to keep moving, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, slowly, she lowered her arms and pointed at me. The other mannequins turned to face me, their eyes wide and unblinking. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, stronger than anything I'd felt before. I tried to speak, to plead, to beg for mercy, but no sound came out. The mannequins began to move, closing in around me, their footsteps echoing in the empty mall. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen chair, and landed hard on the floor. The mannequins loomed over me, their faces inches from mine, their painted eyes alive with something I couldn't name. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights snapped back on. The mannequins froze, their arms outstretched, their faces blank once more. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the service corridor, slamming the door behind me and collapsing against the wall. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the distant echoes of footsteps, the occasional creak of settling metal. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that the mannequins couldn't follow me here. But deep down, I knew better. The mall was their domain, and I was just a trespasser. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out into the parking lot, exhausted and shaken. Mr. Grady was waiting for me, as always. He looked me over, his expression unreadable, and handed me another envelope. "You're still here," he said, almost as if he was surprised. "Most don't last this long." I wanted to ask him what was really going on, why the mannequins moved, what the voice in the darkness meant. But I couldn't find the words. I just nodded, took the envelope, and walked away. That day, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment, staring at the camera, scrolling through the blurry photos, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I thought about quitting, about never going back, but the money was too good, and the questions were too many. I needed answers, even if it meant risking everything. The sixth night, I arrived at the mall with a new plan. I brought extra batteries, a backup flashlight, and a notebook to document everything. I started my rounds, moving slowly, taking notes on the mannequins' positions, the sounds I heard, the changes in the air. For the first hour, nothing happened. The mannequins stayed where they were, silent and still, their eyes blank. But then, just after 2, I heard the singing again. The same child's voice, high and sweet, echoing through the empty corridors. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing, the song growing louder as I approached the old toy store. The door was open, the room dark. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The mannequin in the child's clothes stood in the center of the room, its head tilted back, its mouth open in a silent scream. The song stopped as soon as I entered, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I backed out of the room, heart racing, and slammed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, even though I knew it was broken. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really heard anything, that it was just the wind, just the building settling. But I knew better. Something was wrong with this place, something deeper than just old mannequins and empty stores. I finished my rounds as quickly as I could, barely glancing at the displays, refusing to meet the painted eyes that seemed to follow me everywhere. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out into the parking lot, blinking against the light, feeling like I'd escaped from a nightmare. Mr. Grady was waiting for me again, as calm and unreadable as ever. He handed me another envelope, told me to come back that night, and disappeared before I could ask any questions. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct screamed at me to quit, to run, to leave the mall and its mannequins behind forever. But that night, as I sat in my apartment, staring at the stack of envelopes on my table, I realized I couldn't. not just because of the money, though that was part of it. I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand what was happening in that place, why the mannequins moved, why they watched, why they waited. So I returned, one last time. The mall was silent, the air thick with anticipation. I walked my rounds, flashlight in hand, notebook in my pocket, heart pounding in my chest. The mannequins were waiting for me, their eyes following my every move. I felt their presence, heavy and cold, pressing in from all sides. At 3, the lights flickered and died. Darkness swallowed the mall. I stood in the center of the food court, surrounded by mannequins, their faces twisted into silent screams. The air was electric, charged with something ancient and hungry. A voice whispered in my ear, cold and familiar. "You see us now." I turned, but there was nothing there, only the mannequins, closing in, their arms outstretched, their eyes alive with secrets I would never understand. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but instead, I felt a strange peace settle over me. The fear faded, replaced by a sense of belonging, of acceptance. When the lights returned, I was alone. The mannequins stood silent and still, their eyes empty once more. I walked out of the mall as the sun rose, the weight of their gaze lingering on my back. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I see painted eyes watching from the shadows, waiting for me to return. When the lights returned, I was alone. The mannequins stood silent and still, their eyes empty once more. I walked out of the mall as the sun rose, the weight of their gaze lingering on my back. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I see painted eyes watching from the shadows, waiting for me to return. If you've ever worked a job that felt wrong, or seen something you can't explain, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a good scare. Just remember, if you ever find yourself alone in an abandoned mall, do not look at the mannequins.